and a long-time friend and associate of Cranmer Hall and St John's College, Durham. So without further ado, Norman.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you very much indeed, and I hope you've enjoyed lunch today. One of my favourite preachers, sadly no longer with us, was John Stott. And John Stott used to have a regular habit, apparently, of every afternoon at about 2 o'clock, having a sleep for an hour, just seeing through the rest of the day. That's one bit of advice from that preacher I'd rather you didn't take this afternoon, if at all possible. I do hope you managed to stay awake. We're going to build a little bit this afternoon on what we've heard already this morning, particularly on Kate's imagination pillar and the importance, as she said, of taking the cultural context into account when we preach and teach in the 21st century. So we're going to be looking at that particularly. There are handouts available at the end, which Kate's got over there. If you'd rather have the full set of slides, then on the table at the back there's a list. You can put your email address down on that, and I'll email the slides proper to you on Monday. But the handouts might be adequate, but do take those if you'd like to. Another advert, there are a couple of things available you might want to look at. That's a relatively new booklet we've produced called How Should We Teach and Preach? Much of what I'm going to share with you in the next hour or so's in there, so you might like to look at that. And then if you want to know more about Fresh Expressions and want to look at 30 examples of new forms of church, all in the United Kingdom, then have a look at that DVD. There are conference prices available for both those this afternoon. If you bought either of those this morning, somebody paid far too little for that and far too much for that. We know who you are, and one of you needs to go back and fess up to the desk later. But do have a look at those. So we're going to be asking, in a sense, in the next hour or so, is the day of the sermon over? Let me first of all say what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is that the monologue sermon is no longer relevant. I'm not saying that. I believe it is relevant in a whole variety of places and situations and contexts in the church today. But what I am going to say is that we need other means of preaching and teaching in the 21st century church. What I am saying then is that in a mixed economy of church, in other words, new forms of church and conventional church working side by side, we do need culturally appropriate, transformational ways of teaching and preaching. We need the tried and tested as well as the experimental. That's a really important thing to grasp. I'm not saying we're throwing out the monologue sermon. What I am saying is we need other things alongside the monologue sermon, perhaps in a way they've never really been alongside before. And I want to look at this in three ways. First of all, I want to try and explain why I believe the monologue sermon has to take its place on a new spectrum of teaching and preaching. I want to look then at a bit more theory, really, on the whole idea of how teaching and preaching can work in the church today. And then finally, for the last hour, at about 3:15, we're going to spend time in groups trying to imagine what culturally appropriate teaching and preaching might look like in a variety of contexts. And hope you enjoy that exercise as we come to do it a little bit later on, before we hand over to David to reflect on the day for us. Let's look then at what people are saying about preaching and teaching in the 21st century church. I think it has got a limited appeal. If you're talking about a monologue sermon, it has got a limited appeal in many places and in many ways today. And there's been some interesting research done on that. Here at Codec back in 2010, and the booklet is available on the bookstall at the back, there was a very interesting piece of research done. 16 churches, 200 people researched, and they were asked about their attitude to the weekly sermon. And it was interesting because almost 66% of those surveyed said they frequently looked forward to the weekly sermon. And I think I don't think that figure will have changed over the last 4 years. A significant proportion of churchgoers look forward to the weekly sermon. But here's the catch. Less than 17% of those people said sermons made a difference to their lives. I wonder if that's partly why they were looking forward to it. They knew they weren't going to get rumbled in any way. 17% said it made a difference to the way they lived. But there is still, isn't there, a stout defence of the monologue sermon, and maybe we heard a little bit of that from Andy this morning too, and that's right, there needs to be a defence of the monologue sermon. John Stott argues for the sermon monologue almost being the very words of God. He talks about it as being almost the very words of God, and sees the monologue sermon in a quite different class to, say, a discussion group midweek in a church. He believes that it's unique because the living God is present when you preach in a traditional sense and has promised to make himself known through word and sacrament. Stott says nothing could ever replace this. Rooney believes that the New Testament itself is a result of Christian preaching and also a form of Christian preaching. In the beginning was the sermon, he claims. And the New Testament, he goes on to say, might not contain an explicit exposition of what preaching is, but there are many scattered references that throw light on that question. But I just wonder, I'm happy to be corrected on this, but I don't think there's an example of a sermon routinely preached by a pastor or teacher to his congregation in the New Testament. So there's at least a question mark in my mind whether in New Testament terms what generally happens on a Sunday morning in most of our churches is really preaching at all. And Rooney hints at that, doesn't he, by saying that there's no explicit exposition in the New Testament of what preaching is. Stuart Murray Williams, an Anabaptist missiologist, rehearses the claims for the monologue sermon like this. He says, most Christians, or many Christians, believe that the monologue sermon has got a biblical mandate, that in that you're bound to have an encounter with God, that the monologue sermon is here to stay and should not be impacted by changes in culture, because it served generations of Christians well. Again, I wonder about that. But I want to repeat it, in many contexts, I do see the conventional monologue sermon as an appropriate form of preaching and teaching. But I am left with these questions. Is Stott right in equating word with the monologue sermon as he does with in his book, I Believe in Preaching? Is that right? And if preaching is indispensable to Christianity, can Christian communities really exist without the monologue sermon? But does preaching have to equal sermon? I think we've already heard this morning that it doesn't. And if the New Testament doesn't contain an explicit exposition of what preaching is, should we be careful about expounding one? Because we're quite quick to do that, I think. So there are questions left in my mind, but these aren't new questions. Don't know whether you can read this or not. I've grabbed it off a friend's Facebook post. But John Wesley said, "What marvel, the devil does not love field preaching? Neither do I. I love a commodious room, a soft cushion, a handsome pulpit. But where is my zeal if I do not trample all these underfoot in order to save one more soul?" In other words, Wesley was challenging the whole contemporary context then of contemporary definition then of preaching, and said there are other ways of doing this, and we need to take those other ways seriously. In their book, Multi-Voiced Church, Stuart and Sian Murray Williams claim that the dominance of the monologue sermon can be traced to the Christendom shift, during which the clergy became more powerful and the laity lost their voice. So he looks back to the first few centuries of the Christian church, for example, or they look back to that period, and say that as clergy became more powerful, as Christianity became more institutionalised, the laity lost their voice and the monologue sermon gained a foothold. You may want to talk about that a bit later on. But the authors too are concerned about unrealistic demands made on preachers to produce sermons week by week which inspire, encourage, equip, motivate, and so on. That's a tough call, say, the Murray Williams. And is it something we ought to be assuming preachers can churn out week by week? But the Williams also say that monologue sermons, to some extent, make unrealistic demands on the congregation. The Williams believe that we hear more sermons than we can possibly respond to properly. A possible alternative, they suggest, in a post-Christendom context, is a multi-voiced approach to learning. And we've already heard this morning, haven't we, that preaching is the work of the whole church, not just those traditionally called to preaching. A multi-voiced approach to learning in which those gathered participate together in a conversation. And they point out that the original meaning of the Latin word sermo and the Greek word homile is the root of conversation. It's about a conversation. And the conversation could be open-ended. It needs to be free from pat answers. It needs to leave people time to think, to reflect, to explore, and to ask how biblical teaching might apply to their situations. And we'll have more on that later. In fact, some would see in the New Testament itself a multi-voiced approach to preaching and teaching. In a paper written by Stanley Stowers, he looked both at the literary and archaeological evidence in his study of Paul's preaching. And he quite clearly believes that preaching was an attempt to teach or persuade, but we don't know what form it took. But he looks particularly at Paul's preaching and said something which I found quite surprising. He argues that Paul would be much more likely to be speaking in public than private, but he concludes that the declamatory speech, the traditional speech, would have been the exception, not the rule. So although Paul was preaching and teaching, the traditional way of doing that, the speech in the open air and so on, would have been much more the exception than the rule. He believes that Paul in his teaching, his semi-public teaching, would more likely to be gathered in a house with crowds invited in, a large house probably of a wealthy person, but the crowds gathered in there listening to him in a more informal way than we imagine he often would have been out in the marketplace. Jeremy Thompson blames the monologue sermon, or it's not the monologue sermon, but it's the way it's got primary use in the church. Jeremy Thompson would blame that on the reformers. He argues that the classical sermon as we now know it is an innovation of the reformers and their followers. Again, you might want to just think about that later and come back to me on that. So I want to question too the belief that the monologue sermon has to be the prime mode of preaching and teaching in the church, as I listen to people from other disciplines. Much of contemporary educational theory, and particularly work on learning style preferences, springs from the writings of Freire. He was a Brazilian Christian socialist and a theorist in the whole area of education. His main work was published in 1968, details there on the screen. And he questions traditional models of learning where the teacher's task is to fill the students with the contents of his narration. Contents which are, he says, detached from reality, disconnected from the totality which engendered them and could give them significance. In purely secular education, he warns against turning the hearer into a container, into receptacles to be filled by the teacher. I often have conversations with clergy that go a bit like this. They'll be complaining about their congregation and they'll say, I've taught them that week in and week out for years. They're still not hearing me. And what I've got to gently say to them is, maybe you need to teach that in a different way if they're not hearing you. It's no good at all just thinking that if we pour good stuff into people, it'll automatically make a difference to their lives. That could be called, in a sense, the banking concept of education. And in that view, in a sense, the teacher, the preacher, has all the power, knowledge and wisdom, and the person listening simply has to accept what is on offer. Now, I can't believe any of us feel preaching should be like that. Kolb is another educationalist who believes that learning is the process whereby knowledge is created through the transformation of experience. So he would argue that it's not just what we hear, but it's what we experience that's important. And Andy very helpfully drew our attention earlier before lunch, didn't he, to the way in which God clearly believes that, by giving us all sorts of experiences as he tries to communicate with us. Kolb's emphasis on the way we adapt as we learn and on outcomes rather than content is very helpful, I think, because he believes that true learning transforms experience both objectively and subjectively. And he does talk about different learning styles, and I found these really useful as I've tried to teach and preach both in conventional churches and in fresh expressions of churches. And he identifies 4 learning styles, which are particularly helpful, I think, as we try and reimagine preaching and teaching in this century. He talks about concrete experience, being involved in experiences and dealing with immediate human situations often is a way that people prefer to learn. It's about feeling rather than thinking. It's about being artistic rather than scientific. It's a kind of learning which values people, which is often open-minded, which helps people to make good decisions almost by intuition. These sort of people, the sort of people who learn mainly through concrete experience, really love helping at a night shelter, but really hate Christianity explored. They like to learn by experience. Then there are other people who mainly learn by reflective observation. They try to understand the meaning of ideas and situations by carefully watching and by impartially describing them. It's about understanding rather than application. It's about what is true rather than about what will work. It's about looking at things from various perspectives, being analytical and having thoughtful judgment. They love being on diocesan synod. They absolutely hate running a youth engagement project in the centre of town. What about those who prefer abstract conceptualisation? They use logic. They like ideas and concepts. They think rather than feel. They build theories rather than dealing with individual situations. They value precision and neat conceptual systems. They love the Alpha course. They hate holding hands in the prayer meeting. And what about those who prefer active experimentation? They actively like influencing people and situations. They like practical applications as opposed to reflective understanding. They like doing rather than observing. They take risks and like to see results. They love the ministry time at the end of the service, and they hate the residential ordination course. Sorry, Cranmer staff. Active experimentation. There are questions around all this, of course, and you might want to raise them later, but for example, I wonder whether Kolb takes sufficient account of cultural difference. For example, a 16-year-old high school student in New York will inevitably have a very different learning approach to a Kalahari Bush teenager. And I wonder whether, for example, his emphasis on learning preferences really take account of peer or fellow Christian pressure. I think, for example, of the way a teenager eventually realises that taking drugs is a bad idea, because often learning is a messy process with casualties along the way, whatever our preferential learning style. This might just be a bit too cut and dried to be helpful. A much more recent, though, analysis of the way younger people learn can be found in the work of Don Tapscott, a Canadian business consultant who specialised in the way organisations operate. And he looked particularly at the way younger people, particularly what he calls the net genners, people born between 1977 and 1997 operate. And he said they're distinctive because they value certain things. Freedom, customization. And if you're not sure what that means, just look at somebody in that age group. As soon as they buy a new mobile phone, the first thing they do is change all the settings on it and make it theirs. They're natural collaborators. They might well be on Facebook while you're lecturing, but that's probably because they're asking their friends what they think of what's just been said. They scrutinize other people and institutions. They insist on integrity. So if the church makes a statement about something, they'll really go like a dog at a bone at that statement till they get to the bottom of it. They want to have fun, they value things moving quickly, and they see innovation as a normal part of life. Now clearly that's broad brushstroke. Not all people in that age range will value all or any of those things, but from his research of a significant crowd of young people in that age group, that's what he found. Now just look at those values and ask yourself, would they fit into my church? Would they fit into my church? And the way that these net genners are choosing to learn forces other changes too, or should force other changes, it seems to me. There needs to be a move from a teacher-focused approach when we teach in the church to approach based more on collaboration, on learning together. That seems to me an important conclusion from his work. And there's a need as well to move more to helping people to find out about things and how to find out about things, rather than simply mastering a static body of knowledge. And certainly modern theological education would be moving much more in this direction. That's really important too. There are significant moves taking place in the world of education, and we need to perhaps take these seriously too in the church as we teach and preach. Maybe more emphasis on interactive learning, more emphasis on discovery, more emphasis on collaboration is what we need. But there are questions about that too. It's all very well to say that this age group, the net genners, will behave in a particular way, but is a net genner in Aberdeen the same as a net genner in Abu Dhabi? Probably not. And how can we explain, for example, the popularity of the conventional sermon in large student churches, where young Christians turn up in their hundreds to hear what we would recognise as a monologue sermon? That's again a really important question to put to somebody like Tapscott. But there are warnings too about the monologue sermon from psychologists. Sarah Savage, who's written a book called The Human Face of the Church, looks very much at this in one of her sections of that book. And she believes that language is power, and goes on to argue that most public discourses, and the monologue sermon could be seen as a public discourse, does three things. They self-legitimise. So in other words, there's almost an internal argument, often in a monologue sermon, that you can't really argue against. They tend to exert power. The way our churches are actually designed emphasise that, often with pulpits higher than any other point in the building, for example. And the danger of any kind of public proclamation or public discourse is that it can easily assert that the speaker is right and others are wrong, because there's rarely opportunity for feedback and for you to comment on what is said. Now, Sarah Savage goes on to say that there's a need for a church environment which enables learning. And she says that will mean us being comfortable about a number of things. It means that we'll allow doubt and questioning openly in those times when we're trying to teach and preach. Now, I don't know what you feel about that. That's quite a scary prospect, to allow 10 minutes during the service for people to come back and share their doubts and questions about what you've said. She goes on to say that we should be willing, and again this is scary I think, to affirm healthy conflict as an opportunity for growth. Most churches are conflict averse and would not be happy with that either. But she says there needs to be healthy conflict as an opportunity for growth. She says we should give permission for play and creative thinking as we preach and teach. And there needs to be built into our programmes too opportunities for reflective and creative processing. And I think that's what Murray Williams was about earlier when they were saying that we hear far more sermons that we can actually deal with and process. I wonder what would happen if we preached once a fortnight and on the intervening weeks allowed time for reflective and creative processing. My minister friend who's always complaining that he'd preached a dozen times on the same topic and still hadn't got it, partly I think had not built in time for reflective and creative processing. That's why people had not got it. And Sarah Savage finally says that there's a need to encourage congregations to learn by doing, not just by listening. Again, that's really important. And many of us are perhaps doing all these things already. And she says that if we allow that kind of culture to exist in church, it might well lead to transformative learning. Transformative learning. In other words, we're actually changing the way people live and behave. Now, all these principles can be applied to all forms of preaching and teaching, from the conventional monologue sermon to the discussion over a pint and a pasty in a pub, or glass of white wine and canapé for those of you with a call to Kensington. But it seems to me that we need to do that regularly. We need to regularly take those sort of principles into account, whatever our context. But I still want to say that the monologue sermon really is fit for purpose in many places. Don't mishear me. But I am left with some theological questions about those kinds of sermons which are sometimes actually preached 6 feet above contradiction. If God doesn't address us from a distance, but addresses us up close and personal, what does that say about our preaching and teaching styles? If Jesus really was incarnated, does that not argue for teaching and preaching which really is close and personal, not distant and disconnected? Now, only bad sermons are distant and disconnected, I understand that. But almost the physical situation in a church so often gives the impression that they're distant and cannot be questioned. There's no reason, and we've heard this quite clearly this morning, and I agree, why conventional preaching shouldn't include questioning and healthy conflict, creative thinking, reflective processes, and learning by doing. All of those can be used even if you want to stick, because it's appropriate in your context, with the monologue sermon. And the monologue sermon can be seen as a corporate spiritual venture, one important way of hearing God. And as Kate said earlier, it's almost as if speech itself can have a sacramental impact, a wow moment, and transforming power. All of those apply to the conventional monologue sermon. What contemporary Christians want, however it's delivered, it seems to me, is preaching and teaching which makes a difference, is honest, has integrity, and is appropriate to context. So what we're talking about here really is about form and content, method and mode, revelation and dialogue. What they want is preaching and teaching which makes a difference, which is honest and has integrity, and which communicates well. That's so important, it seems to me. Somebody mentioned stand-up comedians earlier. I think stand-up comedians can teach us a great deal about preaching and teaching, and particularly about the place of the preacher and the mood the preacher's in when they stand up to deliver what they prepared. Let's just have a few lessons from them for a few moments.
A lot of the time you have to be the fall guy. You know, you have to be the weak link in the story. If it's about being bad at sex, you're the one who's being bad at it. You're not the guy observing somebody being bad at it.
I think the insecurity is very important. I think without it, there's no human being there. I'm not really interested in seeing comedians who just come out confident and loud in a shiny suit. I don't know where the human being is in that person. I don't know where their fear is. I want to know. I want to know who they are. In stand-up, there should be no restrictions between what you're feeling, what you're saying to your friends, to yourself, and to what you're saying to the audience. So by going in front of the audience with only a few bullet points, you end up just having to say these things because you're just desperate for something to connect with someone, and the truth is usually what connects, and the truth is usually what's funny. Sometimes I'm annoyed that they're laughing. I think, why are you laughing? You should be asking me if I'm all right.
Do you ever worry that you're revealing too much of yourself when you do this?
No, the opposite. I always think, this isn't, have I really said the actual truth of this situation here, or did I just get a laugh with that, and that's safe to stay there? I always think there's somewhere deeper to go and somewhere more interesting.
Because for me, to go up to someone and say, hello, what's your name? Perfectly lovely question. Hello, what's your name? Nothing wrong with that question. Hello, what's your name? It's a delightful, curious question, but to me, it would definitely come out like, hello, what's your name?
When you go through your life and the ups and downs and the traumas, do you ever think when you've had a particularly bad day or a bad experience, you think, oh, well, there's some material there at least?
Almost too quickly. Like, it's almost upsetting how quick it can become material. Yeah, I recently went through a breakup, and I'm already talking about it. And I was talking about it 3 days after it happened.
Is that a consolation of any kind, do you think?
It is eventually, but I'm annoyed that it is sometimes, because it means that I'm not feeling things fully, and that's part of what's wrong with me. And so while people talk about stand-up being therapy, it can be the opposite sometimes, because it stops you from fully immersing yourself in the pain, because you can fix it quickly. It's almost magic.
And because you're outside observing it very rapidly.
I'm outside all the time. I'm outside of it. Yeah, I'm not in there feeling hurt, feeling angry, feeling upset. I'm looking at this idiot who should be crying or is crying. I'm sort of making fun of him. It's me. It's me.
I've got to own up now and say I've sometimes used preaching in the traditional sense as personal therapy. I wonder if anyone else has ever done that. There's been an issue in your life, or maybe an issue in the church, and you've kind of used the preaching to work that out somehow. That may or may not be a wrong thing, but it's just something I'm aware I'm doing. It'd be very interesting to replay that clip, wouldn't it, and replace every time they talk about stand-up comedian the word preacher. And there was a lot there about vulnerability, about being open, about saying the same as you would to a group of friends as you would on the stage and so on. I think it was quite revealing in many ways. Reaction so far, we've plenty of time now, so let's just spend a bit of time just reflecting on what I've said so far. Some of it you may not agree with, that's great. Hannah's going to whiz around with a mic, I think, and then we're going to move on to a slightly more practical session for the next 20 minutes or so. So any initial reactions?
I think it's, whilst I agree with what you're saying, I think there's a difficulty in transferring to that style, because in very easy little tasks that you might do to warm up in a service, I've heard pensioners, oh, don't like doing that, and complaints. People just want to apparently listen to a sermon, and yet I'm sure you're right, they would get more out of it if it was two-way. But it's how do you transform from the style that people have grown accustomed to a more interactive style.
Thanks, Dorothy. Has anyone had experience of that, of moving maybe gradually and gently on in the way that you've been preaching and teaching, that you could share and help us with? Somebody on the back row there.
I don't know about gently on, but I was asked last year to do something on Good Friday which was suitable for the children in the church as well as the adults. So we actually did an interactive Stations of the Cross. I began actually by, they all jumped because I threw the tables over in the temple and they all crashed to the floor with the money, and they all shot backwards and looked shocked. The adults in particular, but there were so many adults that came to me afterwards and said, well, actually, I found that really, really good, and I'm sort of in it, and not listening to it, part of it. So that was.
Thank you. So that was an example of in a sense, doing it in a special service, in a distinct one-off way, which helped people to get used to a slightly different style. Another way of doing it might be to run something in parallel, if you can. Now, this is resource dependent. Run something in parallel to more conventional worship. Some churches are now doing cafe church and so on. You can be a bit more experimental in that context. You're right not to push people. The last thing you want to do is alienate them. But there are ways, I think, of just gently introducing other ways of doing that.
There's something in this that's very much about training. I'm just almost through a 2-year course in teaching, during which I'm spending a lot of time, better be careful what I say because my course director is here, learning a lot of theology and stuff. And the way I am in the academic course, there is very little, there is some, but not a lot, about transmitting that, about using that. And one of the things we need to be careful about in having more interactive ways and sharing ways is making sure that the people who are leading are capable of doing that. And in actual fact, the easiest way to do it is to stand up and talk. I mean, I often want to do things, but I haven't time, I'll just do a sermon, because it's easy. I don't have to bother with anybody else. All I do is sit down and try to motivate people to do it. And at the same time, my practical training, a lot of what is going on, I am being observed in my work by people who have been through even more conventional, and some of it, I have to say, conventional many, many years ago, who are trying to mold me into what they are, and are telling me what they would do rather than what they think I might do. And it seems to me that if we're going to move on to different ways of telling the story, then there is some really important ways of doing that, and training ways. Done badly, I've seen it done very badly. I've seen people who've learned a bit about doing film clips and doing plays and things, and then have chucked everything into one service, and it's awful. I've heard people who've come across godly play, and those people who have been trained and do it properly, do it marvellously. Others think, oh, well, it's godly play. I've seen it done, I will do it, and do it badly.
I think I've got two reactions to that, really, two things really to suggest. One is I've been very attracted recently to the concept of reverse mentoring. I don't know whether you're familiar with that or not, but it seems to me now on any kind of informal or formal training course, it's really important to find a reverse mentor. In other words, somebody much younger than you, probably 20, 30 years younger than you are, if that's possible, and get them to talk to you quite often about how you're communicating. And that might be a very valuable exercise. The other thing now, and I've probably never ever invited back here for saying this, but I think it's now almost indefensible that in theological training, alongside training for preaching as we know it and love it, there isn't training, for example, leading a discussion in a pub, or doing something out in the open air with a group of unchurched men. How do you teach and preach in that context? We're moving into a situation in the church where those contexts will become more and more important, if they're not already the case, and to not train particularly clergy and preachers and give them those skills seems to me almost, it's putting it strongly, but almost a dereliction of duty. Because we're putting people into context and places where they're going to feel really out of their depth and uncomfortable. One of the joyous things about involved in somewhere like Cranmer is that when you talk to particularly some of the younger ordinands, a lot of this comes quite naturally to them. They're quite used to sitting in the pub and talking to their mates about their faith. And I'm very encouraged when I see them going into the world and into the church, because I think they're going to be able to take some of those already learnt life skills with them. But for some of us a bit longer in the tooth, that doesn't come naturally. Perhaps one more. I think Andy wants to say something about it.
Thank you very much, Norman, for this. I suppose this is a question. Is what we're critiquing here not so much the monologue sermon, but the monologue sermon done poorly? Because I'm just wondering about, when you think of a monologue sermon, I think most of us, what we're doing, there's a strong pastoral element in the preaching. If you remove the pastoral element from the preaching and from the pulpit on Sunday morning, it becomes very much like the critiques you've listed. It becomes very much like that. But if you have a pastoral dimension to the preaching in which the person doing the monologue actually has relationships with the people within the community, they've been in hospital with them, they were there at the men's breakfast informally interacting with a group of people in the community a few days earlier, I think it tends to blunt the authoritativeness in a way, but yet it also grants an authority too. This person is speaking out of an authority not only of the scriptures, but also he's my friend. He knows me, or she knows me. And I think most of us too in the room would never want to preach a monologue sermon that is absent any sort of reflection. Most of us, that's what most frustrates us. So I suppose what I'm asking is are the critiques more at bad monologue preaching or just monologue preaching in general?
Yeah, I think it's probably both is the answer. I think I am saying that monologue preaching done badly is just unforgivable, isn't it? We mustn't do that. That's just, and I was trying to say there are really good ways of doing that, and imaginative ways of doing that. And certainly in theological education, increasingly we're helping people to do that in an imaginative way, and that's good. But I think I am saying the monologue sermon in some contexts, an increasing number of contexts, will not work whether it's good or bad. It just won't wash as a style, as a form in some contexts and cultures. And that's hard to believe, I think, if, say, you're working in an environment where students are around and so on, because they're quite used to that kind of style. But I think in many communities in the country, that kind of style, however well done, is just not working anymore. So that's why I'm talking about a mixed economy. You need monologue sermons alongside other sorts of styles so that people can access the learning in whatever way suits them best. Pete, last one, and then I'll...
Can I just challenge you on that one? Because I just don't see that's right, because the really big churches that are growing and growing and growing are using monologue sermons. And they're not just student-based churches, they're, the Hillsong churches, the Bradford City Church and stuff like that. Yeah. The King's churches all over the place. These are packed out with people from across the social strata.
Well, that's,
and they're preaching for 45 minutes. Yeah. The black-led churches preaching for hours. Yeah. Where's the proof?
Well,
what you're saying?
Two questions to that, really. One is that we need to look very carefully at the socio-economic mix of the congregations there. There's no hard evidence yet about how far across the social spectrum those sort of churches reach, with maybe the exception of the black churches. So we need to look at that. And the second question is we've got to test somehow, and this applies to all churches, I think, actually how effective those sermons are. Are they really leading to transformed lives? And again, we need the evidence for that. I've not seen it. I'm not saying, therefore, it's not there. And those large churches do appear to contradict what I'm saying, but I just think the jury's out a bit. I think if you look at, say... I think what I'd want to find is a church like that in a non-student environment, a large church like that in a non-student environment that's got a very, very mixed socio-economic background. If somebody can find that church for me, I'd love to go and talk to people there about preaching and teaching, because that would be a really helpful thing for me to do. But I've just got a question mark over it, that's all I'm saying. Moving on. Pete's not going to let me away with that, I know. We'll be tweeting each other later. The big question in my mind is this, then: who will we never reach if we can only carry on always doing things the way we do? Who will we never reach if we simply carry on as we are? And so I want to now more quickly move on and talk a little bit more about fresh expressions and then leave you with an exercise to do. I think at the moment there are probably three ways of, and this is rough, three ways of doing church in the UK today. The first, the attractional method, where we encourage people to come to church. And I suppose Back to Church Sunday is a good example of that, isn't it? Where we encourage people to come to church. And that is working in many, many places. I think the larger churches Pete's just described, in the main, are probably working this model. There's the engaged method, where we realise as Christians that we're not reaching everybody, but we need to go out into the community, engage the community in the hope that many of them will come and join us. And something like the Hope movement relies on that method. We go and then they come back in varying numbers. And then there's the emerging method. And new forms of church, fresh expressions, will be looking at this kind of method, where we'd say, as Christians, we go out into the community, we make friends, we build community, we start making disciples, not with the aim of getting them back to our church, but with the aim of starting church where they are, appropriate for their culture. So three different ways of doing church today. And that latter way of doing church could be defined like that. It will be a church for our changing culture, established primarily for the benefit of people who are not yet members of any church. That will be what a fresh expression was. So when it comes to preaching and teaching in a mixed economy church, I want to just focus in now on new forms of church. And again, this is a growing bit of the church. Some recent work done, in fact, based here on the growth of fresh expressions in the UK is beginning to show that probably up to the equivalent of 4 dioceses have been added to the Church of England as a result of new forms of church in the last 5 or 6 years. So far, only a quarter of the dioceses have been surveyed, and of those 10, if you add the members together in those 10, then you've added about 1 diocese. So it's looking as though maybe up to 4 dioceses have been added as a result of new forms of church, and most of those people only attending that new form of church, not double attending. So when it comes to preaching and teaching, we need to take those forms of church more seriously and begin to understand how we might do that in that context. And I like to think of a spectrum of preaching and teaching. And this is very simplistic, but at one end you might have the monologue sermon, at the other end you might have an open-ended discussion. If you look at the attractional method, with a high degree of willingness to engage and do things on the church's term, you're more likely to aim at that bit of the spectrum. If you look at the engaged method, with a willingness to engage, but with increasing degree of questioning, because those people have not really got much of a church background, you're going to be there somewhere. If you look at the emerging method, which is the one I obviously work in, where there's little understanding of convention and a desire to create a culturally appropriate church, then you're probably going to be somewhere like that. That is simple and maybe even simplistic, but it helps me to see why this spectrum is important. The Pope has recently said that we need to constantly seek ways of expressing and changing truths in a language which brings out their abiding newness. Not only our language, but our methods, I think, need to bring out the abiding newness of the Christian truth. That's the challenge we face. So to just sort of help you to see this in more concrete terms, have a look at this.
I really felt that God was called me to work with men or lads, kind of 18 to 40. We actually discuss what's been going on in the news and actually what issues that raises for us as men. So this week we're looking at kind of suffering because of natural disasters and things that have been in the news. So we just sit and we have a discuss, and there's some scripture there that we look at as well. The camping stuff actually came from a guy who is quite spiritual, maybe wouldn't call himself a Christian, and he said, I'd really like to go out into the wilderness and, you know, maybe chat about spiritual stuff and just be out in nature and in the open air and things. So it's a normal camping trip. We've got fire and meat and man things, but then we've also got a kind of sacred space, an area that is different, that is away from the campsite, that is a holy area, if you like, really.
Die for friends and family, you know, the things that you live for.
I think for a lot of people, when they actually come and join us, it probably doesn't feel very much like church. We eat together all the time. It's very social. It's very noisy and chaotic sometimes. It's not like an average quiet Sunday morning service. And I think people would just say it was a very sociable thing. But hopefully in the midst of that, there is a sense of us learning about Jesus and journeying together with him.
What I like about Cable Street Community Church is that everyone's so friendly, and it's the kind of church where everyone makes you feel welcome and you make new friends.
Is that a bit spooky?
The Cell Church sits alongside the other parish churches, and really we see it as equivalent to a parish congregation. Our Cell Church has lots of little groups meeting midweek, currently 7 small groups, involves about another 40-50 people. In a cell we do everything really that is there in being church. You know, we support each other and pray for each other, we learn from the Bible, we worship God, and we reach out in mission and witness and serving our local community. So everything that a church would do, a cell church does, but it does it in a different way, if you like, and therefore it sort of suits different people.
The cell group that I attend here in Taysborough has been a kind of a mainstay in my life. I have a fellowship, everyone's extremely supportive, it's a family.
St Michael's in the Marlpit meets in Valley Primary School, which is the primary school on the Marlpit estate. We meet every Sunday morning, 10 o'clock, usually for about an hour, and all welcome is what it says on the sign, and all do turn up. Teaching is probably what is uniquely different in that we will break into small groups and do stuff. We may play games, we may paint something together, we may collect things, we may have a quiz. We quite often share in small groups, say something about someone who was a good father to you, and then whoever's leading will gather that back together and bring it into the lesson. It always starts with people. It always starts with people's experience, whether their experience of what we're doing on the day or their stories, their story of their life, of their faith, and then we tie their story into the wider gospel story. So it's not someone from the front telling people what to think and believe, it's drawing out people's experiences and then relating those to the gospel. So it's quite scary because you never know if it's going to work. Sometimes your point is not made because however the activity went shows the opposite thing, but it's always good. And even even the quiet members of the congregation are comfortable with that. We have some sort of safety rules. You know, if you share something in a small group, you don't have to share it with the whole congregation if you don't want to, so that people feel comfortable. But mostly it's very rewarding, and I can honestly say that you come away, even as the person leading the service, having learnt more and seen more and more angles to a gospel story than you could possibly have seen for yourself, because you start seeing the gospel from the point of view of every individual in the church, and that is enormously enriching.
One of the sessions we did on the friendship of God, and we did an art installation which had a kind of a built-in room with a front door and a doorbell that people could go inside and see lots of things around that you'd find in your house, and in there ask questions about what would you say to God if he lived next door to you. So the closeness of God. The next one we did was God of the universe, how massive God is. So we got in a 7-metre science dome which had a 360 cinema in it that kind of showed the stars, and we had a science guy come in and talk to people about the universe, and we had installations about water and the elements and stuff like that to get people to think about the hugeness of God. And we had projections at the front that said, "Let there be light." And we had anywhere up to 500-600 people come through the church during that evening we actually opened 8 and 3 in the morning. We had one guy that came in recently who had a gimp mask on his head, zipped up at the front, and he walked in on his own to the front, got a kneeler cushion, put it down on the floor in front of the altar, knelt down and prayed for like 3 minutes or something. Then he zipped the mask off, took it off, put it next to him, continued to pray for another few minutes, and then basically just got up and walked out of the church. Amazing visual display to see, and I don't know what he did, what he prayed, but he came in and he chose to kneel before the altar of God and you know, take his mask off before God and then walk out again. That's what we're here for.
The drop-in in Hawick is like a shop window in effect, and you know, we do discipleship there, we have conversations, and the way that it's become in church, I suppose, is the fact that, you know, everybody who comes to that drop-in understands that we're about the Christian faith, but we're also willing to serve people and give people real, genuine help in their lives, the help that they need to change. In the sense that mankind came from monkeys. At the drop-in we do something that would look like a Bible study, and very, very often after those groups have ended and everybody's gone for their coffee, because they just last 15 minutes, every time so far somebody will stay behind and we'll have a much deeper conversation that maybe, you know, maybe even lead to laying on of hands in prayer and asking the Holy Spirit to change a life.
So we're going to move on to an exercise in a few minutes and just do some work together on this, but just to help you with that, just some final thoughts. I did a survey about 4 years ago now, 34 fresh expressions, and over 2/3 of them didn't use the monologue sermon regularly. Of those that did, they did it quite imaginatively, I think. All sorts of things happened as part of that more conventional sermon. People gave all sorts of reasons in that survey why they didn't use the monologue sermon too, and they were also interesting, and you'll be able to read that in more detail on the handout. But they were anxious about it be working well in a very all-age context, which many fresh expressions are. They were anxious about whether it would work well for unchurched people and de-churched people, and they were also worried about the whole sort of culture of standing at the front and teaching people not working well in that kind of context. And you can look at that in more detail when you look at the handout. What did they use it as alternatives to that? Well, the majority of them, I think, used either small group discussions or practical activities. They were the two main things. Many people, or a significant number of people, about 15%, used one-to-one as their main focus of teaching, which of course works if you've got a church of 25, doesn't work if you've got a church of 250. And some people used online learning as their main form of teaching too. I think this does, in a sense, tie in very clearly, I think, with having a much more creative approach to teaching and preaching, whether that be within a monologue sermon or in a different mode or form. And Brueggemann says this quite interestingly. We need to embrace an alternative text and its redescription of reality. It's about writing another script for people in a way that they can appreciate. So where does that leave us as preachers and teachers? Are we willing to abandon the script? Are we willing to enter a different script? That's a really difficult question, isn't it? But one that we need to look at and maybe need to begin to value again a very old practice, a New Testament practice, in fact, of testimony as a de-centered mode of preaching. But we do need additional tools if we're going to do that. We need to find appropriate models for reflectors, for theorists, for pragmatists, and for activists. We've got to look at those. And we also need to, in some way or other, develop a balanced diet if we're going to use other things alongside monologue sermons. We need to make sure that we're covering important areas of Christian life if we adopt other ways of preaching and teaching. That's so important, and Dunn Wilson has very helpfully identified those 6 areas. And I found it helpful to translate those onto some kind of matrix and to ask myself, okay, I'm in a cafe church and I want to do some pastoral teaching. How do I do that? Well, it might be that you do some kind of storytelling about overcoming adversity and then link that in to Scripture. What if you run a wild church for men and you want to do some apologetics? Well, maybe that's a pub discussion based on newspaper headlines, starting there and then moving on to Christian and biblical principles to illustrate further. What if you're running a goth church and want to do something missional? Well, you might take some music that goths particularly would value and look at the lyrics of those songs and try and draw some conclusions from that. I found that kind of matrix particularly helpful. So now over to you. What we're going to do now for half an hour is to break into smaller groups and to try and take all that we've heard so far today and put it into practice in some way or other. So this is the exercise. What we want you to do is to identify a theme or a passage, and we want you then to talk about how would you structure a session trying to teach or preach on that theme or passage in a particular context. Remembering that even an apparently informal discussion in a pub probably benefits from some kind of structure, even if that's only a structure in your head. So think about the theme or the passage which will be appropriate for the particular context you're going to look at, and then ask yourselves, how will we structure the session in order to do that bit of teaching or preaching? And we've just given you there 7 or so different contexts. So what you need to do is choose one of those in your group, and can I suggest that you do something really daring and choose the one that you're least comfortable with. Choose one of those contexts, choose a theme or a passage that will be appropriate in that context, and then describe how you would structure the session. And then what we're going to do in half an hour is have some feedback, short feedback from most of the groups if we can achieve that, and see what kind of rich imaginative ideas are beginning to emerge. Let me give you one warning, a really important one. Don't stereotype those contexts. Just look at that first one, for example. Think in your mind very briefly now, what might you do in that first context? Now read it again. You laugh, but there's actually a fresh expression doing something quite similar to that. So let's now break into, can I suggest we break into 4s? Think of the theme or the passage, and then how you would structure the session, having chosen your least comfortable context. And we'll probably have 10 groups doing something with goths or something, but there we go, that'll be interesting. And we've got half an hour for that. We'll finish at 10 to 3, and then we'll come back together for some feedback before David wraps up the day for us. So we'll need to get on with that quite quickly. Appoint a spokesperson right at the beginning quickly so that you know who's going to do that and there's no messing at the end. Over to you. There's water and stuff around the back here if you want to go and grab that. If you want to move around the space a bit, do that too.